So welcome back. We're now in the develop module with the image that we previously brought in. And that image is an image that has got some issues with its contrast range. This is taken in November where the sun is very low, middle of the morning. Lovely, crisp, bright blue sky, as you can see from the image there. But what happens there, even though we're using a little bit of fill-in flash, that the shadows do block up and the mid-range of the image blocks up. Now, how do I know that? Well, there's two ways I know that. I can look at the image and see that, but most importantly, I can see from my histogram here that the majority of the detail is here in the shadow end. There's a bunch of detail up here in the highlight end, but you can see from the fact that it's the blue channel that it's this sky is the highlight, and the mid-tones are here. So the mid-tones are all in this bit here. The darks are all in this bit. So we need to do some work on this image. Yeah. So it's a really good image to test to see where we go next with it. So another good thing that you can do in Lightroom is when you're working on a small screen like this, we don't really need the stuff that is on the left-hand side of the image when we're in the development module at this point. So I can click this little arrow on the left-hand side of this screen and I've turned it off. Now, suddenly, we're only working here on a screen size that's 1024 by 768 because we're projecting the image with a projector. But you can see that Lightroom's really nice that it can work on screens that are this small, or you could be working on a huge, great Apple Cinema display that's 2080 pixels wide, in which case you can do lots of stuff. Or you might be working on two screens, but in this case we're working on 1000 pixels by 768 pixels. So we're on a quite small screen here. So we've turned off, there we are, just show you again. When that's turned off, as soon as you hover over that side, it brings it back so it reminds you where it is. So we're not going to use that. We're going to work on this image here. You will see that there's a bunch of controls on the screen now, some of which are quite advanced and we won't get into in this session, and some are the obvious controls. One of the more advanced controls is a thing called soft proofing. And when we get into a later stage talking about color management and making sure that profiles match for when you're printing things, when you're outputting them for offset litho printing or for particular web use or for particular sets of printers, soft proofing of your images is really important to make sure that the colours that you're seeing are in what's termed gamut, i.e. the colour range is able to be appreciated. But that's quite advanced stuff, so we won't get into that now. It's just so that you're aware, Lightroom in version 4 is able to do this stuff. Some of the criticisms of Lightroom in earlier versions were that the die-hard colour management people thought that it was an inferior product because in Lightroom you couldn't do it, whereas in Photoshop you could. Now the reality is that actually Lightroom is Photoshop, but with a different interface on top. The engine that's underneath that does all of the work is really Photoshop. All right, and it actually is the Camera Raw plugin that you see in Photoshop, which is what you see in Lightroom, but in an interface that is very, very photographer friendly. So let's move on. There's our image in the middle of the screen there. Not a bad image. It's a PR image, so deliberately taken to be a bit different. Taking pictures of people looking straight at the camera, not very interesting pictures. I could do a bunch of things with this image. The very first thing that I do when I come into the development module with any image is to look at it and say, what do I need to do? So before I start fiddling, because I could fiddle with everything in this image and achieve 10,000 different variants if I wanted, or maybe more. What I need to do is decide what do I want to do with this image. Well, I want to actually play with this image a little bit in terms of its composition. So the first thing I might do is actually go to the crop module, and these tools here on the right hand side of the development module, I'll just go through them before we start using them. So at the very top, as we had in the library module, we've got the histogram, And the histogram, once again, is the bit that is the thing that's the most useful in digital photography in terms of telling us the range and distribution of tones from the blacks through to the whites. Notice that when I do mouse over that in Lightroom, it's actually telling us that. So when my mouse is at this end, it's saying blacks. Can you see that below the histogram? And over that end, it says whites. And in here are the midtones, and there it's actually telling you so that's the exposure point there. So that's the middle, the midtones, the shadow end, and the highlights. So Lightroom's actually trying to give you help. As a photographer, you understand these terms. But as a digital image manipulation photographer, maybe you're not familiar. So Lightroom tries to help you. Once again, the details with regard to the exposure and the settings of the camera, the most important ones are given below the histogram. So ISO 250 in this case, a 33mm focal length lens, f8 at 2/50th of a second. Okay, so that's what it's telling you there. Some other interesting stuff that the histogram does in the develop module that you might find useful is that you have these triangles. And these triangles, as soon as you mouse over them, if I turn them on, they will give me exposure warnings either in the shadow end or in the highlight end. And if I actually move the exposure such that we make those warnings work, can you see now that they highlight, they've turned on? Yeah, so they can be very useful to you. Now this image happens to be quite well exposed, so we're not going to see any issues with that. So moving down again, the next set of tools is here. The first one is the crop tool. When we turn that on, we have the ability to see what the image will look like using in this case, the standard is a thirds Graticule. So with your upper thirds and your lower thirds, both left and right. We have the ability to change this, but we'll come back to that in a separate module. If I hit the O key in Lightroom, did you know that? You can change the Graticule. So from the thirds, yeah, both large and small, to the diagonal thirds. Now that's quite important for an image like this because this is deliberately taken at a jaunty angle. Yeah, so you can see that actually my positioning is not too bad there. Yeah, so the upper and lower quadrants in terms of the triangular positioning for leading lines and things, and the golden section. For those of you that are Leonardo da Vinci exponents, you'll know all about golden sections, and actually you can rotate the golden section around as well. Or just a Graticule, so if this is an architectural or scientific image and we need to get lines, the straights, horizontals and verticals lined up, we have a Graticule. The standard one is that. So we'll come back to that in a minute. O. The O key. Yeah. Yeah. So the next one along is the spot removal or the healing tool. And we'll come back to that at a later date. Next one along is red eye correction. So for correcting the images where you've used flash in very dark conditions and your flash light is on axis with the center of the lens and you get red eye, that allows you to correct it. Next one is the graduated filter, which we are going to use in a moment. And we'll see what that does. Next one, final tool going along, is the adjustment brush. We will also be using that in a second. So let's go a bit further down our list of tools here. And what we'll see here in the next block down is a bunch of tools that you will see probably in any photo manipulation piece of software. And it's about adjusting exposure and color. Okay, so the very first one in Lightroom. This looks different if you're working on RAW images to what it does if you're working on JPEG images. When you're working on RAW images, the color temperature for the white, so that you set in the white balance or the color temperature of the image actually is measured in degrees Kelvin. Yeah, and we'll get into the technicalities of that once again another time. And then the overall tint of the image, so bias towards magenta, the reds, or green. Yeah, and we'll have a look at that as well. Next one down is all the various exposures across the segments of the histogram. So we have the overall exposure, so that's the overall exposure of the image, obviously. The contrast, the range that the tones will take between black and white. So if you compress them, you get higher contrast image. If you spread them out, you get lower contrast image. The highlights, which are these things at this end. The shadows, which are these things at this end. The whites are here, and the blacks are here. All right. Then we get some really nice controls that we'll have another look at in a moment, which do all kinds of clever things. We'll come on to those. If we were being more advanced, we might work with tone curves, but that's probably the subject of a later tutorial. The ability then to selectively control hue, saturation and luminance, HSL. And if we open that module up, that allows us to be able to control the various parameters of the image. So we literally can adjust anything we want to in that image. Yeah. Okay, so we'll come back to that another time. Split toning. How do you create split toning effects in Lightroom so that you're emulating the kind of stuff that you can do in the darkroom? So selenium toning and lith printing and all of these kind of things, all done in the split toning module. The detail module is all about worrying about sharpening, noise reduction, and those kind of things. The lens correction module is really an important module in terms of removing artifacts that the lens creates from the image. And the reason that I said the lens detail was important in the metadata, when we looked at that in the library tutorial, is that if you click on this button here that says enable profile correction, can you see that the image changes? So the illumination around the image, a little bit of barrel distortion, it's all been corrected because Lightroom comes with a bunch of presets that are configured for the most common lenses from the bigger manufacturers. So the kind of manufacturers that Lightroom covers: Canon, Fujifilm, Hasselblad, Leica, Mamiya, Nikon, Pentax, Phase 1, Samsung, Schneider, Sigma, Sony, Tamron, Tokina, Zeiss, and so on. All right, and more things being added all the time. So for Canon, this is, as I said, was taken on a Canon 1DX with a 16 to 35mm lens. There's all the lens profiles that are available for Canon. So pretty much all of their lens profiles. And then the profile in terms of whose profile you're using, are you using Adobe's or a third party if one exists. And if you don't have your camera, if your camera is not, and your lens combination not covered, you can still do it, but you can do it manually. And you have the ability then to play with distortions in your image. Yeah. So you can do all these kind of things. So you could actually be doing your corrections for your lens. So that would be a particularly bad lens. And like always, one thing that I didn't cover in the library module is that Lightroom is what we term non-destructive editing. So every single thing that I do, I can undo. Yeah. So one step at a time, just with Command Z or Control Z on a PC, I can undo everything I've just done. Now, I'm going to put a bunch of those things back in again, all right? Because I'm going to now demonstrate one of the other things that's currently hidden on the left-hand side rather, is as we go down to the bottom, we get what is termed the history. And each of those history steps are the things that I have done to this image as I've brought it in. So from the import, through the exposure, things that I've adjusted, right up to these weird lens corrections are all there in history. You can't do that in Photoshop. Because I could actually say, I don't want that particular point, I want to go back to when I set the exposure. So that could be 500 items down a list. I could always go backwards at any point. also have the ability to create what is termed a snapshot at any point. So maybe I actually quite like the settings that I'd applied to an image up to a point, and for one variation of the image I want to do the other things, and for another variation of the image I want to do something completely different. If I create a snapshot from the point I'm at, I can then apply different corrections to that snapshot. That's all quite advanced stuff in Photoshop. We won't in Lightroom. We'll come back to that another time. So let's just go very much back to the beginning. Turn that item off. That's the image as it came into Lightroom. So we'll come back to the top, and let's look at this image. Well, like I said, the exposure is pretty perfect on this image actually. It's not overexposed, it's not underexposed, but we have some issues with the range of tones, the dominance of tones. There's all too much stuff here at the bottom end. It's all a little bit dark. You can see the blacks are black. There is some detail in the black, which is good, but the mid-tones are a bit muted. The sky is probably over bright. What would we do with this image? Well, one thing we might do is we might say, okay, I want to darken the sky a little bit, such that I can raise the exposure of the overall image. Because if I raise the exposure without darkening the sky, even though we might improve the mid-tones, which we've done there, we've lost all the detail in the sky. Have we not? But this is Lightroom. We can do whatever we like. So I'm quite happy with my mid-tones now, but I've got too much exposure in my highlights. Well, one of the things that I can do is I can adjust the highlight slider, and I can bring it back. And look at that. But I don't want to do that, because what I actually want to do is use a graduated filter. I'm going to click on my graduated filter. I'm going to apply that graduated filter in exactly the same way that I would in the camera. Yeah? So I've just drawn on there at the moment. I'm now going to reduce the exposure. And can you see what's happening? It's like using a real graduated filter on your camera. And I can actually shift the angle, if I want, of this filter. Exactly the same way that you would with a filter in its lens carrier on the camera, as we have always done. In fact, that works better like that, doesn't it? Yeah? But in doing that, I've darkened the sky, but I've kind of gone back to the face being a little bit subdued again. So what do I do about that? Well, I just go to my brush module now, click on there, and now I'm going to click on the face. I'm going to say, I think that needs to come up about 1/3 of a stop, and I'm going to paint on it. And hey, look at that. I can zoom in. That's a pretty sharp image, that. Good, these 1DXs. And I'm just going to now, this is now 1:1. So look, this is full size. And I'm just changing the exposure by a little bit of the skin. Click on the space bar again. Oh. Space bar again, click out. Yeah. Now the other great thing about when you're in the selective or the the brush module is the point that if you hold your mouse over the pin button that effectively is that correction, it shows you a mask of the area that's affected. And as well as being able to apply the correction, if you hold the Alt key, I can actually undo the correction. So I did actually affect the bit of the blue sky behind his head, which I clearly don't want to do. So I'm just turning that off again. Come over it. Yeah, and you can see we've turned that off. Maybe I've overdone it a bit too much, so I'm just going to put a little bit back again, come over. Yeah, happy with that. Okay, what I want to do to the image now, let's turn off the brush so that the button disappears. What else?
The more you go over the brush, does that keep down?
Only to the maximum amount that you set. Alright, now, so let's click on the button. So I'd set 0.35 or near enough, a third of a stop. That's the most it will apply. The settings of the brush are actually as defined a little bit further down. So I've got, you can have a brush that's very soft, so there's lots of feathering. The flow adjusts the amount of correction that's being applied. The density is, if you like, the opacity of the correction, and the size is doing nothing other than changing the brush size. As we feather it, you'll see that we go from it being very spread out, so it's, you know, very much like a feather duster, right to at the other end where it's hard. And if I draw something now, so let's just go back and find a correction. If I pick something where I want to, for instance, let's apply a contrast enhancement. If I apply that, can you see how bad that is now when it's a hard brush? Yeah, it's very, very, very obvious, isn't it? If I go back up to my brush setting and adjust the feather to come right up, I can apply that, and it almost as though magically you can't see the joins. Yeah, so you need to think about the feathering. Okay, so that's not too bad. Now, one of the other things that I can do is I can apply a new brush. So I finished playing with this one. I want to apply something new somewhere else. So if I click on New, I drop another pin. Now I want to affect. This is a bit cold for me, this, because this is a crisp autumn day. Colour temperature is quite high. You know, it's up at about 7,000 or 8,000 degrees Kelvin. It's not very warm, so I want to warm the image up, but I only want to warm these mid-tones up. So I'm going to come down my selection list here to the thing that says colour, and I'm going to click on that. And what comes standard in Lightroom are these 5 colours, and those 5 colours are exactly the same as you would have applied with your camera in the old days of film, where you would have put a colour filter over your lens to either warm an image up or cool it down, so to provide some colour correction with colour transparency or colour negative film. So in the case of this one, it's very warm through to slightly warm, or cool it right down. I want to actually apply some warmth, and I'm going to apply that warmth there. Okay, so once I've done that, I now have colour selected in my palette. I'm now going to paint warmth on here, and miraculously, instead of this being that cold image that actually had some issues in terms of it was making me feel cold just editing it, we now are warming that image up quite significantly. Now, I could have done that to the overall image. How would I have done that? Well, firstly, I would turn off my brush. I come back over here to my colour balance. I haven't even done a white balance on this image yet. So I can pick the white balance tool. So I click on that. I come over to an area in my image that has a neutral tone, so a grey or a shadowed white, and I would click on that to be my neutral tone. In the case of here, I've got a number of places I can look, and the place that I would look first would be this dog collar for the vicar, where it's slightly in shadow under his chin. Click on that and the image is warmed. That's the correct white balance now. So what we've done now is that we've warmed those mid-tones up, we've warmed the overall image up to be the correct white balance, and now we have an autumn day with very vibrant colours, exactly as we're seeing right now in this autumn time. Okay, that's all looking a whole lot better. But I could have done some more. I could have played with the vibrancy control, but you have to be careful, because overdoing that overdoes it. So I've chosen to do it selectively by warming those midtones up, bringing the image back to its correct colour, showing true autumn sunshine. I think that looks quite nice. I'm going to now zoom in, 1:1. Lightroom renders that image for me. It's a very sharp image. I'm going to now apply my favourite filter in Lightroom, which is the clarity control. And the clarity control is a bit like a control you would use if images were a little bit soft. Slightly lacking in sharpness. Now this image is not lacking in sharpness, it's very sharp where it needs to be with the person and the eyes. Clarity, you can, if you apply clarity, you can go really over the top to the point where you actually end up with almost over sharpening. The image becomes posterized, right down to the other end where you can create a lovely glowing soft focus effect. And that and the clarity control is really useful for doing that. In fact, you can apply the clarity control as one of the selection brush parameters. So you could soften or sharpen or increase the clarity of an image selectively. All I want to do is take this up to, and I normally apply about plus 14, plus 13 to an image. And that image just becomes really nicely sharpened. Yeah, if I look at that in comparison to that, yeah, you see how the contrast comes up slightly? Can you see that? Maybe you can't see that on the projector, but on the screen here, it makes a massive amount of difference. Okay, so our image is kind of getting there now. I kind of like that. But the thing I still haven't done is sorted out the composition. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to my crop. I'm going to say, okay, really, I want that third there over his face because my eye is drawn to that image better if I do that. So if I crop in a little bit like this now, and I start to put that slightly over his face, maybe bring that out a little bit. Yeah, in fact, between the two, so that we've got the 2/3 there. Now my image is starting to work for me. I like that now. It's got some weird angles in it. I like that. But I could have done other things. Like always in Lightroom, if I hit the Control Z or Command Z on the Mac, I go back to where I was. Yeah, you can see that we're removing the crop. Yeah. What I could have done is I could have gone to one of the corners and I could have rotated it. And if I actually had this pane on, you'll see the reason for that pane being there now. It's showing you what the image will look like when you finish the crop. Can you see that? Yeah? So that's what that pane is there for. It actually shows you the completed image. All right, so I'm not going to do too much to that, but I will show you that in this crop pane, we actually have the ability to add presets. So it might be the original image. So do you keep the aspect ratio? In this case, as I drag here to add that crop, it keeps the original height width parameters. I can right click on there and tell it to constrain the aspect, or I can set it to be whatever I want. Yeah. Or I could use one of a set of built-in crop ratios, 1:1, or lots of different standard photograph sizes, or sizes for more use on TV and other media, or I can enter custom. So if I wanted to have an aspect ratio that was 2.112 by 8.234, in Lightroom I can do that. And there is my aspect ratio that I've just added. And like all good things in Lightroom, if you create one, you can actually store it as well. But I don't want to do that because that's wrong. So there we are, we've got an image that has been corrected in terms of exposure, in terms of colour, in terms of balance between midtones, highlights and shadows. The image is now looking quite nice. The one thing that I might go and do is to add a little bit of vignetting. I want to hold the edges of this image in a little bit. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. But the most important one is probably actually applying the vignetting in the effects panel. So I can either lighten, creating that horrible effect that was a very 1970s effect that some people still like, or I can actually slightly darken. And it's the darkening one I want to do. I can set the midpoint so that it actually moves the circle around. I can set the roundness. I can set the amount of feather. Yeah. And I've kind of held that image together a little bit more now. I'm going to bring that back a bit because I don't quite like too much darkness over here. I'm happy with that. So there's a finished image. I need to now size this image and output this image so that I can use it for something. Because at this moment in time, as we've said previously, this is no more than a set of adjustments to the original image as a database correction in Lightroom. It hasn't really done anything to that image. So if we go from the finished image there to the original image, quite a difference. I think you'll agree. Yeah? Finished image, original image. Quite a difference. So, the last thing I want to do is to output that image, to export it. And we do that in Lightroom in a couple of ways. We either right-click on the image and go to the export, or we go up here to File, Export. And if I click on that, we now get a typical dialog that appears in Lightroom, which is a set of presets for Lightroom and a set of user presets. There are no user presets, this is a new install. We're going to create one. So where do I want to export my document or my picture to? Do I want to export it to a hard drive? Maybe. I could send it by email. I could send it via CD or put it on a CD or a DVD. I'm going to put it onto the hard disk. I'm going to export it to the same folder as the original image, but I'm going to put it into a subfolder, and I call always my images that I'm outputting my develops, so I'll put it into a subfolder called develops. What do I want to do about naming it? I don't want to do anything, I'm just going to keep it to the original file name. What format do I want to output it? So standard might be a JPEG, or it might be a Photoshop file, a TIFF file, a digital negative, or as the original format. JPEG is probably what you want normally to send it to the web or to a photo lab or whatever. The quality of the image, the quality affects the amount of compression in the image and the amount of, therefore, artifacts that will be in the image. We'll talk about that another time. So it's about quality. I normally set this to about 80 for a standard image, high resolution image. The color space, so for web or for low resolution print or for non-professional photo printers, you want to send it to as sRGB. And then the sizing. If I don't click the size button, it will output it at the original size, and that will be huge. Let's just have a look and see what that image was. If you remember, I can drag that to the side. The image was something, I'll have to cancel that for a second. If we go back to the library module, we can look at the size of the image. The size of that image was 5,184 pixels by 3,500 pixels. That's a large image. So we'll just export again. Lightroom's clever, it will know where I got to. So the settings that I would previously set will come back. So there we go. So it's still going to a subfolder from the original called develops, 80 as quality. Sizing. Now, if I was setting this for, I said this was a PR image, this would need to go for PR use. I know that for working with any of the regional, national or international newspapers, I don't need to be bigger than 1800 pixels at any one of the dimensions. I also don't care about the resolution here because the resolution doesn't do anything other than tell the program that reads it what size to call 1:1. So if it's for print use, we would call the size 300 dots per inch or 300 pixels per inch. But all that will do is it will divide the maximum number of pixels in height or width by 300, and that's what the photo editing program will render as the full size image. So if I divide it by 300, it will be a smaller image in the photo rendering program that you send it off to than if I say it's 72 dots per inch. It will still be an image that's 1800 pixels maximum dimension in any way. All right, that's a technical thing we'll get back to another time. So I'll leave it at 240 pixels per inch, that's fine. I will sharpen for the screen. I won't add a watermark or anything like that, and when it's finished processing, I want to see it in the Finder. And the Finder is on a Mac is just like your Explorer in Windows. So that's that done. I'm going to click the Export button, but before I do that, I'm going to save that as a plugin, as a setting. So I click on here, Add. I call that PR High Res. Yeah, set it as a user, preset, create. Next time I want to output an image, I can just use that preset and it will use all those settings and we're done. So I click on export. Lightroom will quickly go away, think about it, render the image because this is a high resolution image. And when it's finished doing that, it will finally pop back up again and we'll see the finished image. And there it is. And there is our finished image, all done. Thank you for listening. If you like that tutorial, my name's Keith Blundy. If you didn't like that tutorial, my name's Osama bin Laden.